I had a choice when I came up here as the only Democrat to speak to you today. I had the choice of talking about Republicans or Democrats, and I actually thought about talking about Democrats until I heard Mitch, and so now I have to talk a little bit about Republicans. I'm still going to talk about Democrats, but I think it's unfortunate that what you saw from Mitch McConnell, what you heard from Mitch McConnell, is a big part of the problem, because virtually everything he talked about was an electoral message. If you think about it, everything pitted Republicans against Democrats. To the extent at which he said, when he was talking about raising the gas tax, he said, presumably that's what Obama would do to fund infrastructure. Well, there's never been a word out of President Obama's mouth about raising the gas tax. To my knowledge, there's never been a word from any Democrat about raising the gas tax to fund infrastructure, because it's a bad idea. It's not just a bad idea politically, it's a bad idea economically, because as anybody who's paid attention knows, we're using less and less gasoline. That's one of the reasons that gas prices are as low as they are. So to base the funding of your infrastructure future on a declining revenue source wouldn't make much sense. That's why some of us in Congress have proposed using a repatriation of earnings concept to help fund infrastructure spending in the United States, so that we would allow corporations who have parked money overseas to bring it back at a preferred rate if they invested a certain portion of that in some kind of infrastructure funding mechanism like an infrastructure bank. So there are interesting approaches being considered, but the point is, that's not the way that Mitch put it. There are a lot of other things I would like to spend my 20 minutes. And by the way, if you've got 5 Republicans, they got 100 minutes to my 20, so I got to speak relatively quickly. But you know, Mitch, I'm glad Mitch is not a history teacher, because he seems to have a different perspective on history. So for instance, when he talks about his obstruction of Supreme Court nominees, he's willing to go back to the Grover Cleveland administration. He says that's too far to go back for a precedent, and yet when he talks about hostility in politics, he's willing to go back to Jefferson and Adams. So it's just a difference in perspective. And by the way, what he's done is so selectively define the last time that this kind of thing happened. So he says that the last time that a Supreme Court nominee was confirmed in the middle of an election year was during Grover Cleveland. Well, first of all, February is not the middle of an election year. It's the beginning of an election year, but that's beside the point. Back in the late 60s, there was a candidate, a vacancy in the Supreme Court was filled with 15 months to go before a new election. So is it 15 months or is it 10 months or 9 months? It's kind of a silly argument. The point is the American people elected Barack Obama to nominate Supreme Court justices in case of a vacancy. They did that for 4 years, not for 3 years and 1 month. And he can come up with all the rationalizations he wants, but it doesn't make any sense. And in fact, if you want to talk about history, this is the first time in American history since the Senate has held hearings on Supreme Court nominees that a nominee has not gotten a hearing in the Senate. First time in history. One other thing I want to clear up before, and I want to get into some things that really aren't electoral, but this is policy. First of all, Mitch is talking about right to work and prevailing wages, things that we need to do in Kentucky. Kentucky's really bad shape, right? That's why for 2 years running, we've been named the best in the country in new business development. We're in such a competitive disadvantage. He talked about prevailing wages making the Omni Hotel project cost more. They're building it. They haven't stopped, as far as I know. It's still being built. It's still going to be built. And the Omni organization still thinks that it's worth doing, despite a prevailing wage. And by the way, in right-to-work states, the average income is about $6,000 less than it is in non-right-to-work states. So you pay on the one end with corporate profits by taking money away from the people who work for those companies. One other thing I want to mention before, again, and that's the issue of the EPA and coal. And again, I just want to set the record straight. In 2009, the Supreme Court had ruled that under the Clean Air Act, which I don't think Senator McConnell or anybody else has advocated repealing, the Clean Air Act, the Supreme Court said that carbon emissions are pollutants under the Clean Air Act and have to be regulated. EPA has to do it. This isn't Gina McCarthy's discretionary call or Barack Obama's discretionary call. The Supreme Court directed it. So what happened then? I was in Congress then. We were in the majority. And there was a piece of legislation introduced called the Waxman Markey bill. And the Waxman Markey bill, which was better known in many parts, particularly Kentucky, as cap and trade, barely passed the House. Now, the only reason it passed the House is because several of us who came from states who derive a disproportionate amount of their energy from coal plants went to our leadership and said, the way this bill is written now, we cannot vote for it, and you need our votes to pass it. And the reason was because it was going to drive utility rates up dramatically in our Commonwealth and in Louisville. So what we did was we negotiated, and we got them to change the bill. They changed it in such a way that before I voted for it, I called every major user of electricity in my district, GE, Ford, UPS, Jefferson County Public Schools, Metro government, virtually everybody you can think of. And not one of them was against the bill. They all said we're either supported it or we're neutral on it. Then I called LG&E and said, what will this do to home rates? And they said, we estimate that this bill will increase home utility rates by 15% over 10 years if nothing else is done. So you don't improve your insulation, you don't change light bulbs, do any of that stuff. So 15% over 10 years. And then I called the State Energy Department, and they said, we are not taking a position on this bill, but we do believe it will add tens of thousands of jobs in Kentucky if it's enacted. So with all of that, I voted for it. It passed barely in the House. It was killed in the Senate. Never got to a vote in the Senate because Senator McConnell and Senate leadership didn't want it passed. Even though, by the way, cap and trade was a free market approach to dealing with pollution. It's how we solved the acid rain problem under George Herbert Walker Bush when Senator McConnell voted for it. But all of a sudden, cap and trade, when proposed by a Democratic administration, became cap and tax and something we couldn't consider. So after that, after the failure of Waxman Markey and that free market enterprise to dealing with with carbon emissions, the EPA had to act unilaterally, and that's what we're dealing with now. Just wanted to set the record straight on those things. Now, some of you have heard me say this before, but one of the problems we do have now is that politics for too many Americans has become a spectator sport. It's all UK or U of L, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Part of it Mitch mentioned. The media polarizes things, likes to have food fights. I'm a willing participant in that activity on many occasions. That's what they're looking for, and you can't let one side have the entire playing field, although today's one side's going to have most of it. But the real problem is that, at least on the federal level, virtually everything we're dealing with is really complicated. Healthcare is the classic example. You're talking about 18% of GDP in this community. It's about 25%. It is the biggest Rubik's Cube that anybody ever tried to solve. So when and it's not as true of other things, but when you're looking at energy policy, education policy, immigration policy, you name it, these are all really complicated issues to deal with. And they can't be simplified, but the American public, for the vast majority of people, don't have the time, energy, and in many cases the interest to get into the weeds and figure it out. So that's why when we were debating the Affordable Care Act, one side was saying death panels and government takeover of health care, and we were trying to say, well, here's what it does for you, here's how it helps the people who already have insurance, getting into a little bit of the explanation. Again, most people don't have time for that, so what do? They default to their team. They're either UK fans or U of L fans. And that's the position they take. That makes it very difficult to have thoughtful discussions about serious questions. And that's a huge problem in this country right now. That's one big problem. The other big problem is that we don't have governing mentality in Washington. And what I mean by that is, when I was a staffer on the Hill in the early 70s, elections were about 3 months long, campaigns were about 3 months long. Once the campaign was over, you went back into governing mode. You thought, what can I do to solve problems? What are the challenges facing my constituents? How do I work to do that? That's not how it works at all. First of all, the campaigns never stop. And secondly, every issue, regardless of how important it is, how complicated it is the thought process is, how do I get a competitive electoral advantage over the other side? That's the thinking, not what's the best policy. And I know it doesn't have to be that way. I was part of the Gang of Eight in the House in 2013 that spent 7 months trying to develop a comprehensive immigration reform proposal. We met every day we were in session for 7 months, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans in a room, hashing out things the way you would expect rational people to do it. If it were, let's say we were talking about employer verification system, somebody would say, what if we do it this way? And somebody else would say, well, if you do it that way, then I might lose this group and this group, or this becomes much more difficult. Well, how about if we do it this way? Yeah, I might be able to sell that. It was that kind of thoughtful discussion, day after day after day. At the end of the process, we had a proposal that we were convinced would do 2 things. One, could pass both houses. The Senate had actually already passed a bill earlier that year. And secondly, would fix the problems in immigration. And by the way, this is a problem that can't be ignored. We have to act on immigration reform for a wide range of problems, or reasons. Ultimately, we never got the bill to the floor. But the only reason we were able to get as far as we did was because we did it in secret. We negotiated in secret. There were no leaks. There was no media. There was no talk radio saying, oh, so-and-so gave on this point, so he deserves a primary challenge. Or somebody else out there saying, I'm going to spend $1 million to beat him because he wavered on this. But that's the kind of outside influences that make compromise very, very difficult. So somebody asked a question about tax reform of Andy Barr. If anybody thinks in this current environment that tax reform is possible, then I got a bridge that, no, we actually have 2 bridges and we don't want to sell them, 2 new bridges. But when we did the Affordable Care Act, there were 7,500 lobbyists in Washington dealing with that piece of legislation alone. If we had comprehensive tax reform on the table, we'd have 20,000 lobbyists there. It's virtually impossible, again, in this with all the dynamics that I've been talking about, that we could accomplish much in that area. I think we'd have to send the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee into the woods, build a moat-protected facility, take away all their electronic devices, and say, come back when you have a completed package, and then you voted on it all at once. That's the only way I think that's going to happen. A couple of other things. I know Mitch always talks about regulation, being regulated to death, and Andy talked about that a little bit. You'll hear it from Brett, I'm sure, as well. But we had an opportunity this year to do something that really took a swipe at regulation and made it much more effective. We passed a bill in the House called 21st Century Cures. 21st Century Cures was a bill that not only allocated $9 billion, almost $9 billion in new funding for NIH for intractable diseases over the next 5 years, but streamlined the FDA procedures so that we can get both new pharmaceuticals, promising pharmaceuticals, devices, and therapies to the public much quicker. That's one of the big problems we have in healthcare right now. Again, it was going to streamline regulations, make it much more efficient. Passed the House Energy and Commerce Committee, on which I sit. Brett sits on it. Ed Whitfield sits on it. 52 to nothing. Nothing passes the House Energy and Commerce Committee, 52 to nothing. Passed the entire House with more than 400 votes out of 435. Still has not gotten a vote in the Senate. So we've got all sorts of institutional problems going on that while I certainly applaud Mitch's work last fall on several items, and he does deserve credit for getting education reform done and infrastructure, and also the bipartisan budget agreement, which saved us from a government shutdown, or I'm sorry, a default on our debt through 2017. He was instrumental in working those deals, but there are a lot of things that are not getting done that could make a huge difference in this country. Now I'm going to say two things about Democrats. I think Democrats are making a big mistake in the way we react to all of these charges about regulation and fraud and abuse in government programs. I've written a piece about this for Huffington Post, and I talk about it a lot. Whether we like the label or not, accept the label or not, and I do accept it, we are the party of government. We believe that government is an important element in keeping our society together and improving people's lives. It can be a very useful tool. The way I talk about it is, I said government is the way we organize our responsibilities to each other. If that's the case, and we are the party of government, we have a greater stake in making sure that government works right than Republicans do. Let them scream about fraud and abuse and regulations that don't make any sense anymore. We ought to be out front saying, let's get rid of regulations that don't make any sense anymore. Let's go after the fraud and abuse. We can't routinely defend programs just because we don't want to be seen as being weak on regulation. We need to be stronger on that. And one of the things that I've been talking about, for instance, is telecommunications policy. I'm on the Telecommunications Subcommittee on Energy and Commerce, and the Federal Communications Act, which regulates all of the things that we all deal with every day, phones, television, cable, all of that. That act, which was originally passed in 1934, was last authorized, in other words, last revised in 1996. There is virtually nothing about the world of communications today that resembles 1996, not to speak of 1934. There was there was almost no internet in 1996. There was barely satellite television. It was a fledgling technology. There was no satellite radio. The world is vastly, there was no Facebook, no Google, none of that 20 years ago. And yet we still have things on the books that date back to 1934 and 1950 and so it's insane. So I and several others, and mostly Republicans, have said we ought to rewrite the whole law. We just ought to throw it out because it cannot be sensible. It cannot be an effective or efficient or meaningful regulatory policy. Most importantly, there's no way it can provide any public benefit if we haven't looked at this for the last 20 years. And I think that's true of a lot of our regulations. And what we've gotten in under this Republican majority is, instead of saying we can work together, and I'm not sure how willing my Democratic caucus would be, I am, but I'm not sure how a lot of them would be, we can work to get rid of regulations that don't make any sense. But that's part of our major responsibility as a Congress, is to provide oversight on the laws that we ask people to abide by. And we have a greater stake in making sure that government is effective and efficient and provides public benefit than Republicans do, and we ought to work on that. And finally, one thing I mentioned, because I always do, well, I'm going to do two things real briefly. One is, I'm really concerned about the fact that Congress, at its optimum efficiency, moves at 2 miles an hour. I used to say 10, but now it's 2. And the world is moving at 100 miles an hour. And I wonder how we can continue to make policy that makes sense in a world that's moving as quickly as it does. Give you one example. Just during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, we allocated about $8 billion to high-speed transit. And there are a lot of people who think we ought to be investing more. The Chinese are investing tens of billions of dollars a year in it. Japanese already have it. Western Europe has it. We ought to have it. But then we now have cars that can drive themselves perfectly, virtually perfectly, which means in 15 years we'll have cars that can drive themselves perfectly at 200 miles an hour. When that happens, who in the world is going to take a high-speed train? Nobody. The point being that 20 years from now, the billions we're spending today on high-speed rail may look like the dumbest investment we ever made. And that recurs in virtually every field. In education, technology is rapidly changing education, the way we think about it, the way we implement it. Energy, another field that's being dramatically changed by technology. Healthcare, those of you in the healthcare field know that as well. So we've got to figure out a way as a Congress to make policy in the context of a rapidly changing world, whereas right now, what we do is make policy as if the world's going to be the same 5 years from now as it is today, which we know is not the case. One other thing that I just want to put out an alert. You're reading a lot about what Governor Bevin is trying to do on Medicaid, and I want to make it very clear what's at stake here. Governor Bevin has put forth a proposal, what's called a Medicaid waiver, to change the Medicaid system in Kentucky. You read about all that. He wants people to have skin in the game, all the rhetoric that he's used to do this. He has made a proposal that he knows will be rejected by the federal government because they've told him it will be. They negotiated with him, with the administration. They've talked to him about what would be acceptable in a waiver and what wouldn't be. He deliberately proposed something he knows they will reject. His mission, and it's a mission that he talked about in the campaign, he made no secret about it. As a matter of fact, it's on page 15 of his proposal, that if he does not get this waiver, then he is going to, by executive order, rescind the Medicaid expansion. What that means is 440,000 Kentuckians in everybody's congressional district, in your hometowns, are going to lose their coverage, which means that more hospitals are going to go bankrupt because they're going to stop being paid for the care they're providing. All sorts of bad things will happen. So he's doing this. He's saying he's trying to improve Medicaid. He's not. It's a very devious approach. He knows that the federal government's going to reject it, so then he can blame the Obama administration for his having to rescind Medicaid expansion in Kentucky, which, by the way, is the model for the country. When people ask, what do people say about Kentucky? One thing they say is they've done an unbelievable job in implementing the Affordable Care Act and expanding coverage to their citizens and creating the model insurance exchange in the country. That's one of the things they're saying as well. That will all go away if Governor Bevin has his way.